So wonderful to have you here again, everybody, on Moving Online number 10. This time featuring Zhu Hua. About her, Rudy will say some words afterwards. But first, let me express how happy we are that you are here. So right at this time, I would like to ask Rudy, would you like to continue?
Yes, very welcome to all of you. It's nice to see lots of friends we've met before on various occasions. I would like to start with a brief episode I read in one of Zhu Hua's essays. The question was, "Where are you from?" asked by a waiter in a hotel restaurant in Bangkok. The answer was "upstairs," by her son, 3-year-old, who intuitively understood the situation correctly. I like this episode because it addresses very nicely a question that has sometimes been overlooked. So Zhu Hua has at least two great advantages in analyzing this type of thing for us. First, she has been looking from outside at many things which may seem normal to Europeans. And secondly, she has researched extensively the learning and socialization process of the children in relation to different cultural contexts. This makes her research all the more interesting, I find, since over 30 years, intercultural research and much of intercultural training had focused almost exclusively on culture-based values. Identifying values, for example, as the programming of the mind and similar. As a side effect of this, the role of language in intercultural encounters and training was underestimated for a very long time. Even though critics had argued values are passed on through the use of language from generation to generation, be it families, social milieus, or as some would say, discourse communities, language was often seen in intercultural field as being neutral, like a neutral tool, which is definitely not. On closer inspection, it is particularly revealing to see what culture-based assumption may be in language and how we use it, namely as social markers of inequality, power, or even violence or equality. So Zhu Hua is addressing this today, and we're greatly looking forward to your talk. So Zhu Hua, it's all yours now.
Well, thank you very much for your kind invitation and very warm introduction. It brought so many memories back, Rudy, that conversation. And today, we're all going to talk about where are you from and where are you really from? And I will set the context of the conversation in the topic, symbolic power and conversational inequality. So I'm going to share the screen. I'm going to talk about 50 minutes, and then we will leave some time for question answer towards the end. Can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Great, that's great. Okay. So you may have come across this book before. This is actually a book published by the Chinese designer who lived in Germany for many years, Liu Yang. This book is about with the title of East Meet West, and was published in 2007. So it's actually a really nice book. It visualizes the differences between Chinese and German culture. For example, the status of child in the family, as you can see, the top one, there are huge differences between the East and West and how important the child is to the family. And the bottom one, you may have guessed, is about social relationship and how complicated or how straightforward things can be compared between East and West. So there has been lots of this kind of discussion and public discourse about significance of intercultural differences in everyday life. And this is just one example. And we have heard so many of these kind of stories from the medium and also from books, publications, and things actually happening on the everyday basis. So, but among all these discussion and growing awareness of intercultural differences, there seems to be romanticized notion of intercultural communication. Problems in intercultural communication or interactions are very often seen as or presented as misunderstandings and can be made good if people make effort. However, it's actually more complicated than that, as many of you would agree with me on this. And there are things that's actually rarely talked about in research and in the public discourse about intercultural differences. For example, penalty for intercultural differences. If you are interculturally different, you may have some penalty. For example, when you actually seek for a job or apply for a scholarship. I have some research done a while ago looking at presentation of self in application letters. What I found is looking at my data that using the Chinese students and comparing with British students, I found that Chinese students tend to make subjective claims of their achievements, subjective in the eyes of English speaking selection committee. Examples are, I'm a graduate in English with excellent academic record. I'm enthusiastic about linguistics. As you see, these enthusiastic are will be regarded as overstatement. They are not the best way of describing your passion or commitment about a field. In contrast, a British student would make a claim that, for example, they would say they have achieved distinction across all subjects, but at the same time, he would also offer sort of a system recognized evidence to back up his claim. So what I'm trying to say is, yes, there is a penalty, and sometimes there is a blurred line between linguistic and cultural issues. In intercultural interactions, there's often a pecking order that is subtle and deeply ingrained in one's subconsciousness. And the burden of adaptation and accommodation is very often placed on those who are at the bottom of the pile. So this is the picture taken in 2012 London Olympics, the media center in London. This picture made headlines, and that's actually slightly before the social media age. So newspaper still was the main source of information. So there was lots of debates about this, whether it is appropriate to put up a sign that's actually written in Chinese only in the International Media Center, which was actually reporting where the international newspaper journalists were based during the Olympics. So this sign, written in simplified Chinese character, what it's trying to say is requesting presumably Chinese-speaking photographers to seek permission before taking pictures out of respect for privacy. So the public debate that actually surrounded this picture very much focused on the apparent cultural differences. For example, it is a known fact that the photograph taking was very common practice among some Chinese people and some other groups. The boundaries between private and public lives are also discussed cross-culturally. There's also issue, rightly or wrongly, the issue of a discrimination through the choice of language in a multilingual, multicultural workplace that also came up in the debate. So this is actually a very interesting incident that shows burden of adaptation, accommodation is very often placed on those who are at bottom of the pile, and there is a pecking order in the intercultural interaction. The third area I thought would be useful to flag up in terms of things we rarely talk about but actually definitely need more research and more attention, is the intercultural differences intersect with political struggle or divide. These are two pictures reported again back in 2012. It was the news headline at the time that appeared in many English language newspapers says Swedish ambassador inadvertently offends Iranian president by crossing his legs during meeting, not knowing that Islam shoes are considered impure. I don't know whether you have come across this as a news headline before. So it was actually was alleged that the newly appointed Swedish ambassador insulted the Iranian president by exposing the sole of shoes. And this was presented the intercultural differences, but also actually presented as ignorance of knowledge and how these intercultural misunderstanding can lead to political divide. However, a number of Iranian students and scholars I talked to following the incident have actually told me that the news headline is confusing, to say the least. They were explaining to me that similar to many other cultures, it was nothing unusual to sit with legs crossed in their home culture, and whether exposing soles or not was not a problem at all. So with their help, I traced back to the Arabic newspaper, Asar Iran, where the news first appeared. It turned out that the news was reported then was a Swedish diplomat was frowned upon, not because he exposed the soles of his shoes, but because he breached a diplomatic etiquette by sitting too comfortably and crossing legs in a formal diplomatic meeting. So it's got nothing to do with intercultural awareness or intercultural differences. It is very much a professional etiquette he has breached. And most recently, pandemic has brought attention to intercultural health behaviors, the differences, and potential serious consequences for the intercultural differences. And one area, probably people are familiar, is face masking, whether and why we wear face mask, for whom, and how to actually reinforce policy if that's a policy endorsed by the government. And there has been really interesting debate and discussion about different health behaviors and the moral discourses around why people wear face masks. So far, we have discussed the inequality exists in many different aspects and different levels, such as ideology, social class, age, so on and so forth. And there is also a complex relationship between language and symbolic power. Language is a resource for negotiating power differences, and at the same time, its very use is subject to power differences. And Claire Cramsh, the latest book, which just released last week or 2 weeks ago, is about language as symbolic power, is very much on language is symbolic power rather than language and symbolic power interplay. So it's actually very clear and emphasis on the role of language and other semiotic signs in doing symbolic power. So the questions need to be asked are, how is symbolic power defined and constituted in intercultural communication? How does power inequality impact the way language is used? What is the appropriate research approach to studying the working of the power in ICC? And we don't really know all the answer, but this is somewhere I'll be very much interested to look into together with my colleagues. And I would like to have your views later in the questions and answer session. So for the first question, symbolic power, what is symbolic power? Symbolic power was a concept first introduced by Pierre Bourdieu in his seminal book, Language and Symbolic Power. And in Claire Cramsh's latest book I mentioned earlier, symbolic power is defined as a power to use symbols. So it's not just language, but words, pictures, images, behaviors, etc., etc., to not only denote things in the real world and connect status authority, but also to change people's perception and evaluation of that reality. It's a social symbolic concept, i.e. a way of influencing or having action on environment through symbols. Because it's based on suggestions and persuasion, symbolic power can only operate with complicity of the people on whom it is exercised. So it's not a one-way interaction, it is two-way. People have to recognize the value of a symbol in order to be influenced by it or to be changed by it. So to the second question, we have had the opportunity to work together with a team of 6 authors. We actually have published a special issue a while ago on symbolic power and conversation and inequality in intercultural communication, the very topic I'm talking about today. And then in these range of 6 papers have looked into how symbolic power interplay in intercultural communication. And I'm going to focus on my paper, jointly written with Li Wei, on where are you really from? Nationality and ethnicity talk in everyday interactions, to give you a taste of the work that we have done through this special issue. So in this code you see on the slide, it was actually from Frank Wu's work. Frank Wu is the first Asian American law professor at Harvard University Law School. And he shared his experience about the perpetual foreigner syndrome, a problem facing many Asian Americans in everyday social interactions. He made a point about how discrimination against a group of people is instantiated through recurrent and seemingly innocent questions. So in the article and we have published and worked together, we talk about this kind of discourse and examine how questions such as where are you really from in everyday talk could reflect people's flawed assumptions about others, resulting in exclusion and marginalization of certain social groups and contributing to benign racism, a kind of racism which is routinized and inconspicuous. We will refer this kind of benign racism discourse as nationality and ethnicity talk, the discourse that either explicitly or implicitly invokes or orients to one's national and ethnic memberships. So these are the conversations like this. The questions and topics range from direct ones. Where are your people coming from? What is like back home? When are you going back? And there's also implicit ones. For example, English so good. What's your real name? So these are examples of a nationality and ethnicity talk that actually may vary and differ in the directness, but irrespective how direct or indirect they are the discourse that invokes or orients to one's ethnicity or nationality in everyday conversation. And here is a video clip that shows nationality and ethnicity talk. We call it NET talk in action. And if you can hear it, give me some up.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice day, huh?
Yeah, finally, right?
Where are you from? Your English is perfect.
San Diego. We speak English there.
Oh, no. Where are you from?
Well, I was born in Orange County, but I never actually lived there.
I mean before that.
Before I was born.
Yeah, like, where are your people from?
Well, my great-grandma was from Seoul.
Korean. I knew it. I was like, she's either Japanese or Korean, but I was leaning more towards Korean.
Amazing.
Hamshasina. There's a really good teriyaki barbecue place near my apartment. So I actually really like kimchi.
Cool. What about you? Where are you from?
San Francisco.
But where are you from?
Oh, I'm just American.
Really? You're Native American?
No, just regular American. Oh, well, I guess my grandparents are from England.
Oh, well. Hello, Governor! What's all this then? Top of the morning to you. Let's go sporty! Double, toil and trouble! Mind the gap! Beware, Jack the Ripper! Bloody hell! Pip pip! Cheerio! I think your people's fish and chips are amazing.
You're weird.
Really? I'm weird? Must be a Korean thing.
Sorry. I hope you enjoyed the video clip. It's a short one. So in this video, the man who was surprised by the woman's English began to look for the answers he was hoping for by asking the questions one by one. And the questions I will call NET talk. So where are you from before that? And where are you people from? It also contains some implicit net. His comment, your English is perfect, despite being a compliment, positioned the Asian-looking woman as a non-native English speaker, therefore a foreigner, someone who doesn't belong to an English-speaking country like like US. The net talks are accompanied by his further stance making through his speech adjustment and rendition of a foreigner talk. So these are foreigners talk is actually people do when they actually think the other party doesn't understand their speech by slowing down, by saying loud, things people do when they thought the other people doesn't understand the language. So somewhere in the conversation, he was thinking loud and talking about his categorization, which seemed to rely upon the woman's physical appearance. And in the last part, the guy was trying to display his cultural assumptions about Korea. And he started the utterance with a bow, which actually, you may agree with me, which more stereotypical of Thai courtesy rather than Korean style, and accompanied by a tokenistic but completely out of context use of a Korean phrase, "감사합니다," meaning thank you. He then referred to a teriyaki barbecue place and made a comment about kimchi. Needless to say, these cultural assumptions and the stereotypes are superficial and very much essentialized. So I hope this gives you some sense of NET and what people do with it as unfortunately a humorous but bad example of how not to do NET. So why does net matter? Because in everyday interaction that we see in the video, they can create and maintain differences between races and ethnicities. And they reflect a reflexive relationship between discourse and social interactions. And in the social linguistic studies, people talk about accent hallucination. That's actually when you actually, so this is actually by Lippy Green's work. She was talking about when the Asian American studies, when they actually, the Asian American study, if they don't really see these people, they very low percentage of people will actually report Asian American accent. But if they can see the visual cues of these people are Asian, there were a higher percentage of participants in her study that report they could hear Asian accent. So for Lippy Green, she was talking about this phenomenon as accent hallucinations. And we all have folk theories of race. And in one of the work, people talking about we all have these generalizations or views towards what others are supposed to be or things we associated with the others. In another piece of work, in the field of social psychology, people have looked at identity acceptance threat inflicted by a recipient. So what do they do when you feel your own identity, self-perceived identity are threatened? So in these studies, two findings are particularly relevant to today's discussion. So when they actually look at how people respond, who tend to be regarded as a foreigner or non-native speaker, they found Asian Americans seem to have a higher percentage compared with the rest of being misperceived as from another country or non-native English speakers. So we are really talking about the sampling in the university student population in America. In another studies they reported is when you are asked, do you speak English? And they have a control group and experimental group, and two groups may have a different performance regarding how much. So the task, I should have mentioned, in the second experiment, the task is making a list of TV programs back in 80s. So when people feel their identity being American was threatened by asking a quite indirect question, do you speak English? They actually work harder to come up with a longer list of TV programs they know in a way to prove themselves they are American, they are entitled to their self-identified American. So this is actually quite very interesting evidence to show people will behave very differently when their identity felt threatened. And in elsewhere in the social linguistics and in the research about migration or cultural studies, it has been reported there was unprecedented complexity of identities. So here people talking about hybridity, hyphenated identities, but there is also research suggesting whether you think they are hybrided identity or hyphenated identities, they are not harmonious fusion of multiple identities. They are actually not multiple identities in one. When people have multiple identities, the interaction between different identities are different from just a simple mass of putting these identities together. And in another study by Frollo, she also identified the identification is closely linked to political struggle and inequality. And again, different people in her study, Frollo study, she found participants behaved, reported differently in different political contexts. And in my own area, language learning and teaching, we have some evidence research suggesting race matters in language learning. So what do people really think about NET? In the next few slides, we're going to look at people's response to an online article about NET by a journalist called, her name is Ariane Sharim. So this is the articles and the comments. She was a comment writer, and she put a very short article, a lead article with the title, "It may not be racism, but it's a question I'm tired of hearing." And in that article, she reported the conversation she had heard for over 3,000 times. And that conversation is really about, where are you from? So this is the conversation she said she have heard so many times. The stranger, where are you from? Me, London. No, where are you really from? London. No, where are your parents from? Africa and American. So where are your family like back in the day? So for Ariane Sharin, she commented, it's hard to go back to somewhere you have never been. It's not that I'm embarrassed about my ethnic background. My reluctance partly down to exasperation at people thinking I'm less British than them because I'm brown. So it's actually, what she wrote there is interesting, But for this particular article, we are actually interested in how people responded to this lead article in the comments. And because this is the comment column, they have plenty of space for commentators. And of course, we can't really see their real identity. They all use pseudonyms to comment and debate on this particular topic. And over 3 days, there were over 1,000 comments and people talking about how they think about this kind of a talk. And in the analysis, the analytical tool we use is a stance. And stance is a public act by a social actor achieved dialogically through overt communicative means. And in the online commentaries, is a particular stance is particularly useful term because when participants make comments, they're not only positioning themselves with regard to opinion piece and taking their stance for or against the previous comments, but also introducing new stances and creating the textual context for the next one and creating new context for the next comment. So we are interested in what kind of stance people actually, these commentators, when they read Ari's articles, how they respond, what stance they take, whether it's aligning with the lead article or not, and what positioning might tell us about commentators' folk theories of race and ethnicities. So we have actually spent a bit of time looking through the commenters, comments, and these actually are two types of stance. One, we call it non-alignment stance. So there seem to be the alignment stance and non-alignment stance comments are more or less same. There are slightly more non-alignment stance comments. So these are the questions are talking about. The first type of non-alignment stance is questioning credibility and trivializing Sharon's questions. So in this comment you see on the screen, the one commentator was talking about, I always thought that Guardian journalists assumed that when asked where they were from, the questioning meant Oxford or Cambridge. So this is a clear step towards the perhaps elite background of some journalists working for the Guardian. Another type of a non-alignment stance which emerged from the comments is to challenge the truth value of Sharon's proposition that the conversation reflect racism. And that's actually the key message for her article. These comments emphasize that there was nothing wrong with the question because A, it happened to themselves before, and B, it is only small talk and the standard conversational opener, and C, people are curious, D, and it's not racism. So all these combination of various reasons people use to undermine the racism proposition that's actually proposed in Sharon's lead article. So in the comment you see on the screen, this has actually received a higher, very high recommendation rating. So this reader, a self-identified white person, pointed out that people just simply interested and what Sharon encountered were triggered by people's curiosity about interesting, unusual things, such as unusual surname. So the third type of non-aligned stance is what they are trying to do is to normalize the existence of NET. And in fact, they argue that it happens to them for a good reason and is a normal conversation practice. As you see on the slide, it's a comment from reader who talk about, in general, Europeans is very big label essentializing, take interest in foreign countries, like to hear about it, and lots of ethnic people are proud of their provenance. And the last one I'm going to look into today as a non-alignment stance is the argument, I'm more diverse than you argument. So in this comment on the screen, people are talking about they position themselves. It's actually interesting to see when they disagree with Ari's argument, they position themselves as someone who may have more reflexive awareness about diversity than Shireen, and therefore more authority in their non-alignment stance. So this guy was talking about nobody is completely English, and even his wife, whose family name dates back to many years ago, is a bit of that and a bit of this. So a mixed background. His main focus, however, was on whether it is okay to ask where one is from, rather than the issue of entitlement. So this is actually the one of the key issues Sharon has made clear in her lead article. And as you see from these examples of non-alignment stance, there are numerous folk series of race and ethnicity that surface in the comments. There is the assumption that majority of white people in Britain are of European ancestry, for example, white race equivalent European lineage. There is also a view that British have a diverse origin. British is equivalent, English is equivalent diverse origin. And some folk theories are unfounded clearly. For example, in the race, equivalent is pigmentation, or race is superior. One particular race is superior than the other. We forgive foreigners a lot because they are foreigners. We don't expect them to know the same thing the locals know, so on and so forth. So compare with these non-alignment stance, as I mentioned before, there are more or less the same, but slightly less comments that are aligned with Ari and Shireen's comments. And there are different reasons, different types of argument people and stance people present to align themselves with Ari's. So the form you see on the slide is actually providing new mocking version of NET. So this is another version of the where are you really from stories. Stranger, so what's your name? In, stranger. Yeah, what's your real name? It's really in, no. But on your birth certificate, that's what it says on my birth certificate. No, really? A number of readers with Asian connections share their experience and feeling of personal of frustration, exclusion, and marginalization influenced by NET. One reader with student name Super Sweet, who self-identify themselves as half white, half Chinese, and born in England, and spoke English as native language and got top grades in A-level English literature and advanced extension word exam. Basically means she has every single certificate that needed to prove she is actually, her English is very good. She felt she was constantly challenged by this kind of discourse such as NET about her good English. I get similar questions she was talking about, but I didn't know quite what to say to these things. First, might I add that I got top grades in A-level English literature and AEA, so on and so forth. So this is sharing her own experience of NET and then her frustration not being able to respond to that. So the folk series, as you see, is race is equivalent to native English speakers, and race is equivalent to education. And there are different pecking order according to the education level. The second, here is an example of some people living in China, and they also share, have the experience living in China. They share their experience of NET while they were living in China. So this one, with pseudonym Xiao Mu Gou, apparently British, talk about his experience of being treated as Lao Wai, meaning foreigner in China, and how people begin to make cultural references once they found out he was British. He also writes about his strategy of turning table by calling the other party Lao Zhong. So this is actually a code word mimicking the word 老外, but meaning old, respectable Chinese. And so in doing so, he turned the table and played with words. There's another reader, she shared the experience of being singled out as a flamingo in the high street in China. Although they find the experience endearing, they also admit that the practice can be tiresome, as one of commentators report, one of the readers reported her experience in Japan, actually. So as Marcus Moy argued in their review of the 8 common conversations about race, they were talking about race is not something that people have or are, but rather a set of actions that people do. Doing race always involves creating groups based on perceived physical and behavior characteristics, associating differential power and privilege with these characteristics, and then justifying the resulting inequalities. So language as a powerful and influential social agent in constructing social relationship is exactly one of the actions whereby people do race, among other things. And in NET, nationality and ethnicity talk, I hope I have convinced you, we see not only the mechanism of construction of social relationship, but also act of symbolic play, whereby people subjectively position and calibrate us versus others by questioning their entitlement, authenticity, and legitimacy, all central to the notion of identification. So what has transpired from the analysis is the predicament when it comes to people's view on NET with regard to implicature, intention, and appropriateness. As we see, NET is prevalent, is everywhere in a sense. It doesn't just happen to people of Asian origins living abroad or from the white to the non-whites. Similar experience also reported among many people who are not Asian, but different from the local or the norm in one way or another. There are people, including some people with Asian background, who do not see any problems with these questions. And in fact, they are proud of their history and eager to talk about their differences. However, what is significant is that for some group of people, the conversation is likely to be met with resentment and regarded as an act of exclusion and marginalization. So the quote from one commentator made a spot-on comment on how the same question may be fine with others, but may become a racist comment when applied to a different group. She said, when I'm in China, I'm asked a question all the time. I never feel is racist, but I would feel I was being somehow racist to ask a Southeast Asian appearance person that question if I met them in the UK. Like I was suggesting, they were an interloper in the country. So the question, where are you really from itself, doesn't actually present a racist question per se, but it is a tangled history, memory, and expectation that actually makes difference. So this is the central argument that's going back to the special issue I mentioned earlier. So for visible minorities, their identities are often ascribed and racialized based on their physical appearance and then placed in a devalued racial group outside the dominant group. The truth is that race or ethnic hierarchies, where racial groups are put in a system stratification, with some racial groups believed to be superior or inferior to other racial groups, matter and still exist today. Many of the folk series of race and ethnicity, as we have seen in the comments posted in the online discussion forum, irrespective of their stances, are alarmingly flawed. showing biases and superiority towards others. And precisely because these visible minorities feel discriminated against in general, they debate and they impute to the question, where do you really come from? An intention to challenge their entitlement to the place they live and to having an authentic and legitimate identity despite visible differences. So going back to the special issue I mentioned earlier, we talk about the 3 questions and we don't really know on the answer, but I hope this special issue, I have actually went through very quickly one studies by me and Li Wei. The first one, how is symbolic power defined and constitute intercultural communication? And in that special issue, we have argued there are different phases, multiple phases symbolic power. They reflected in the power to manipulate the context and power to play with signifiers, power to reframe the interaction, power to position oneself institutionally in times of educational change, and power to gain a profit of distinction, and power to explore power relations through strategic misunderstandings. And to the second question, how does power inequality impact the way language is used or vice versa? The challenge, as I have actually argued through looking at the question of where are you really from? The challenge is recognizing the nature of symbolic game and choose the best local strategy to turn the game to one's advantage. And it's important to reflect on this term proposed by Claire Cranch. She called it symbolic competence. So it is an ability to frame and reframe distribution of symbolic power in intercultural communication. So it's not just competence, but looking at the additional ability to shape the conversation and to redistribute the power through the interactions. So the last question, and this is the last one, I would very much actually to hear your views and your comments, is what is the appropriate research, approach to studying the working of power in ICC? And I can think of, for example, reflexivity and keep doing it. And I will welcome any suggestions and your comments on this question and other questions and terms and issues raised in this talk. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. I would say how wonderful, and thank you very much, Zhu Hua. I will now help you to unmute yourselves. And also, if you want to post questions into the chat, so that we can get into a nice talk.
Maybe, shall I start with a question? Thank you, Zhu Hua, for your talk. Yeah. That was very interesting. I've recently read a book which is actually called But Where Are You Really From? And I bought the book, and it's just a cheap paperback, because I was interested in the whole question and the kind of issues that you talked about today. What surprised me about the book, though, was that actually these kinds of questions that you've been raising were just covered in a couple of pages. And actually, the person was originally from Zimbabwe, and she was, or is, extremely proud of her heritage, and she wanted to explain about her heritage. So the whole book, which was really interesting, was actually explaining about her grandparents and her parents and her the influence of that. And so it left me with the question, you know, she still felt when people asked her, where are you really from? Because she's in Britain now, that was a kind of rejection of her belonging here. And yet at the same time, her background meant so much to her. And, you know, so there's a kind of contradiction, isn't there? So there's the question from an intercultural point of view, how you can sort of start a conversation and give the person the space, as it were, to talk about that without feeling that they are being treated as someone different.
Thank you, Helen. Really nice to connect you here. Hope you're well. I love to have the title of the book you read. It just sounds really interesting. And what you said is actually really interesting as well, very relevant, precisely the kind of things I think we need to look into a bit more. I think the question is, everyone, including all the speakers and audiences here today, we all have history of who we are. But at the same time, there is also the more complex issue of identification. The identification, for me, there are two parts. One is actually your own self-oriented identities, things actually you actually associate, you accept, you think who you are. There's also the other part in interactions is actually the identities ascribed by others, how other people think who you are. So in this process of identification, there are two parts in it. And that's why I think it's actually really important to see interactions, identity in interactions. I think sometimes what you think you are is okay, it aligns with how other people think you are. Perhaps these people will actually use visual cues, audible in how you speak English with what accent, or the readable cues by looking at your names, whether the name is pronounceable or not. All these cues to figure out who you are. And when they actually sort of work together, align with each other, that's not a problem. When they are discrepancies, or when there are differences, and that's where there can be problems. When you actually labeled wrongly or put in a different box, the box that you don't really think is actually you're comfortable with, and that's where the tension can come up. And then thirdly, I think the really important one is having history is one thing, but having your entitlement to a place of belonging is challenged by ask, you know, where are you really from? Because people actually, there is a history. And I think the key finding, one of the key findings is actually people respond differently to these kind of questions. We do recognize for some people, it's fine. People love talking about their biographies, and actually very often people use this as icebreaker, but it's actually not okay to be asked, you know, like Irene Shireen said in her positioning article over 3,000 times again and again, because when by repeating that question, you are put in a position, your belonging and your sense of belonging is challenged by these benign questions. So I think this is really shows complexity of identity and identification. And that's something as interculturalists, we really need to actually look in a bit more. How we actually to engage people, giving people the choice of choosing the identities, but also respecting their rich histories and biographies, trajectories. And I think that actually can be done with very good conversational skills and with a sensitivity to the differences and particular tangled histories and memory these people, including myself and maybe some of you, actually have accumulated in the intercultural encounters. I don't know whether you have any further questions or anything you want to respond to that, Helen, or other people here.
I'll respond quickly and then give others chance. As you know, I lived in China for many years. And I, of course, was very regularly asked. Well, actually, it was often, I kind of laugh, people sometimes not knowing I spoke Chinese. I would hear them say, oh, look, a typical American, which always made me laugh since I'm not American. But anyway, what I was going to say, always that, but I was never offended. And I think why? Because I knew I would never be accepted as part of China, you know. So, you know, that was like an impossibility. So it wasn't an expectation, because I had no expectation of being accepted as a local. I was never offended. So it's also partly expectation.
Perhaps I may connect to this because, as you said, Zhu Hua, this is a co-constructing process, of course. Both sides confirm definitions and constructs. I would just like to comment on a word that you and many in the context use, that's race. And I only recently talked to a professor at the University in Koblenz, who had recently been teaching at a US American university. And the topic of race came up for obvious reasons. It was only recently. And she said, we don't use that word in Germany on account of our Nazi history, of course. We don't use Rasse, which would be the appropriate word in German. But at the same time, I would absolutely agree with her. We don't use the word and we don't use the concepts as such. But at the same time, I have the feeling we use the word racist, rassistisch, in an inflational way. All political corners use it to bash people from the other side. So you can be racist towards the French, you can be racist towards the Italians, you can be racist against anyone, actually. Coming back to our context, since we are all in intercultural research and training, I would answer your final question, how are we to deal with this? Of course, it has been a major subject for intercultural training, and we often use the word othering, just to separate you from me and my group. I'm different to you. And that perhaps connects very directly with how I approach people. And as you rightly say, it's in language. How do I construct a relationship through communication? And what kind of language will help me to establish another relationship? And that's what I find very helpful in your approach, looking at what is in language, what's going on, what are we co-constructing? And the examples you're giving are a co-construction of difference and separation. So I interpret your intervention as an encouragement in terms of looking and teaching discourse strategies, which may be helpful in co-constructing, let's say, something like togetherness.
Thank you very much. That's a really, really nuanced response, and thank you for sharing. I think that, yes, absolutely. Words has a history, and then there are words actually, and it's very much actually subject who used it before, by and when and how. And there are absolutely words, as some of the chats I have actually flagged up, and also you talk about, for example, for language learners and new to the language, they may not aware of, but they actually need to understand the history and stories behind this and learn when to use it, how or whether not to use it, these words. And I think yes, definitely, language is really important part of intercultural encounters. And I think the other thing is language. Because of the communication and language study have recently broadened up the role of language, not just actually language as code, but also looking at other parts of a semiotic system. For example, science images, they're all part of this language and science system that people can use in navigating and negotiating the power struggles. Auntie, I just realized there are some comments in the chat. Am I supposed to read them and then, yeah, is that okay? Or you are going to help me out on this? There are some really nice comments. I think there are information about the book, and if people are interested, and there's some really relevant literature there.
Exactly. Let's start with Frank's question, which was first, and he is asking, what are proven reactions to win the power struggle implicated by this question? Where are you really from? That's one question. And I would like to add, are there proven reactions to win at all? Yeah, that's one question. And the other question is around the matter of symbolic competence. And Uli is asking, would you describe the female runner's reaction in the video as an example of symbolic competence?
Thank you. That's a nice trio of questions. Yes, the proven reactions to win the power struggle. And I think, there are some really nice ones in the examples we have seen. And exactly the video clip you have seen, I thought that was actually quite a humorous response, nice humorous response to turn the table. I think turning table is actually really interesting, strategic move to challenge the inquisitor, the person who asks a question in a nice way. So the second question, female runner reaction to, as example, symbolic competence. Yes, absolutely. Symbolic competence, exactly the ability to change and shape the direction of conversation. And I think she did a terrific job in pushing back.
Yeah. Ability to change the confirmation in a non-racist way. I mean, you can change in quite different ways, but I think you have in mind when you are speaking about symbolic competence, a word, by the way, which or, an expression, which I like very much. But isn't it more open? I mean, if you're speaking about symbolic competence, there are many variations or versions.
Yes, symbolic competence, it is really about the ability to change the direction of conversation, to shape, and then to change the status quo in the power struggles. And there are many different strategic ways of doing it. In another example, not actually related, well, not as part of that special issue, we also look at strategic essentializing strategies. And in this case, the speakers, the participant I studied actually label themselves, essentialize themselves as a way of sort of teasing the other party, but also actually flagging up, using that, the strategic essentializing strategies to demonstrate how unfair essentializing label can be in the conversation. So that's actually quite a nice example of changing the direction of conversation and using these self-essentializing devices. So essentially, this is a story about artists who arrived in London a few years ago from Poland. And as she was looking for acting job, and what she found as a Polish girl, she was often offered a casting job as a cleaner or nurse, including, she actually had a casting job in East End. For people who actually know East End, you know, this is actually very popular soap, the television program people watch every day. So she ended up having a casting role as a nurse there. And she found, you know, as a Polish immigrant artist, she found this kind of situation. She got really tired of being offered just, you know, casting job as a cleaner and nurses in the in the casting. So once she told us a story of herself, how she actually changed these stereotypes. So once she was actually introduced to a new director, and they were actually getting to know each other together with other members of the team. And when it was her turn to introduce who she was, she just said, "I'm just a Polish actress." So that's actually quite an interesting story to actually show how we individuals can use these labels to challenge and to make people aware in some essentializing practice are not justified, cannot be taken for granted, cannot be accepted as it is because people used to do it.
Yeah, thank you. Also, thank you for me, at least, for introducing this NET. Yeah, what is it now? The nationality and ethnicity talk. So it makes it much more clear what it's all about. There is another question from Vinita. What about the role of linguistic strategies to turn the tables, like accent, use of formal colloquial language, and so on? What do you think about that?
I think these are all lovely examples of linguistic strategies to turn the tables. I have been recently working on the notion of translanguaging. So this is the new notion, understanding how speakers, including multilingual speakers, how speakers actually make use of all the linguistic repertoires they have and all the systems of signs, not just language itself, to make sense and also challenge, transgress the boundary in a creative and critical way. And I think translanguaging, the example you have mentioned, accent, use of different language varieties, code switching, mimicking others' ways of speaking are excellent example of translanguaging. And they are excellent ways of challenging the boundaries and transgressing the assumed borders between different languages and between different identities.
Yeah, I can see. Uri, what about you?
Sorry, I had my mic off. Adrian, I had the feeling you wanted to say something. No, okay. Any other comments, questions?
I would like to add a little anecdote, if I may.
Sure.
When our daughter was one of our daughters was 5 years old, I heard her on the telephone talking to the mother of a friend. And she spoke with this broad regional local accent that is used in the south of Germany. And I said to her, oh, I didn't know you could speak like that. And she said, of course I can. I use it when I want to make a good impression. And she was only 5 years old. Oh. And I think that, you know, kids very often have this instinctive feel for how to sound in such a way that, you know, that the othering effect is sort of mitigated as far as possible. You know, you look different, But if you sound similar, which is something you can change, you can't change your appearance or your skin color, it helps.
Yeah, very nice example.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think,
Sure.
sorry, Udi, sorry. I think I just want to respond to that as a just lovely example of how young children as young as 5-year-old are very aware of the power they have through language, through doing languages. And we have an article in that special issue actually look at the preschool children, what do they do? And I think in a way quite sad, but actually interesting is actually in that study, they found a child who actually newly arrived in the United States and how he coped with transition period and how other children somehow use English because he's new, his English is not quite there. And then his friends quickly learned his English is not as good as them. So they use English to diffuse the situation when they had argument. And so this is a quite young children, I think 4 or 5-year-old. And then the other child who actually clearly was in the wrong, but then she figured out if she accused the little boy whose English is not as good as her, pointing out his grammatical error, and she can get away from the nursery teacher. And I think the example in that article was the little boy realized the girl who actually was native English speaker was making a mess with their cake. So he diligently reported to their nursery teacher, and this little girl was making a mess. However, he used the wrong gender term. Instead of saying she, he said he, and that didn't help. So the little girl quickly began to actually point out, so why did he call me a boy? So instead of being sort of penalized for making a mess of the cake, she got away with it because she cleverly played this power game, and the nursery teacher's attention was caught to the wrong gender in the conversation rather than actually focus on what has gone wrong. So that was actually a nice example. Your example reminded me the work actually in that special issue talking about children as young as in the 4 or 5-year-old, they are very aware there's the power they have through their languages.
Yeah.
Adrian, you unmuted yourself, so you're in the starting blocks, I assume?
No, not at all.
Okay. Any other comments?
From Michael Panzner. He has posted a question on the chat. And he says, as to your question, Zhu Hua, on how to approach studying the workings in ICC, I see the following aspects: hierarchy and reputation of different languages in different parts of the world. What is the view of multilingual people? Why do third culture kids often prefer the local language instead of one of the others they have at their disposition?
That's actually, yeah, interesting question. So the question about potential hierarchy and reputation of different languages in different parts of the world. And then this is actually, and reflecting on the multilingual people, particular third cultural kids. Third cultural kids, people may be familiar with that term, is actually quite a nice term to refer the children of people who actually travel to different places. And then, yeah, and third meaning not first, second, but third, referring the number of places they have been. So in the I think we actually need to look at the assumption a bit more carefully. I don't think it's always a case. The third cultural case always ended up speaking the local language, but certainly in the cultural adaptation, there's certainly some recognition. If you want to, function, have the function well in the host community or in the local community, knowing the local knowledge does help. It is actually about going to shopping, going to restaurant, ordering food. So in terms of these cultural adaptation, there are certain expectations. Having the local knowledge and local language helps. Having said that, I think the just actually so putting in a probably wider picture, for many migrant families, I don't know whether this is actually, this may not be the similar situation as a third cultural case. There are certainly, we see the language shift in many immigrants' family, meaning when the first generation, when they arrive, usually the grandparent generation speak the home language. There are the host language, meaning the local language is not there. And in the second generation, you see mixture of home language and host language, local language. And in third generation, you see the shift. The younger kids actually begin to see the language shift to speak the local language. So that seems to be the general pattern. However, there are exceptions, and it's actually quite interesting to look at those exceptions. So the current view is actually there are lots of language maintenance activities at the family level, and as well as in the community. We're talking about complementary schools where people can send their children to study during the weekend after school hours. And there are also community organizations which also play a key role in maintaining and transmitting the language at home within the community. And at family level, and there's certainly lots of studies actually shows parents, grandparents, and relatives can play a very important role in keeping alive the home language while actually encouraging kids to learn the local language. And I think from my own research and other researchers who actually done multilingual learning, language learning, the transition time is for the family is actually when children started going to school. And that's actually, we often see a clear shift to the local language when the children start in school. And that's a critical time for the family to think about their language planning and policy and what they do with language, which languages, and then come up with ways of protecting or maintaining the home language if they need to. So that's just some thoughts and then some comments on the current research on the sort of different scenarios of language situation among multilingual families.
Also, Michael's question about the differences of the reputations of languages. I remember the very old word barbarian, which comes from the idea that the not Greek-speaking people, it was an onomatopoetic word like bar, bar, bar. They did not understand what they said. So they created this word barbarian, which was degrading the people. I mean, quite bluntly, I would say. It was all barbarian, just because they did not understand.
I think, thank you for bringing this back. Actually, yes, I think the language reputation is part of a language beliefs we all have. Similarly to stereotypes, we all have some general assumptions, things actually we're associated with particular group. And the same with language, ideologies, things we believe, think, French is romantic, for example. That's kind of things we all sort of accumulate and then get socialized through the discourse or socialized through the people, the stories we hear. And that's actually definitely shaped by lots of different factors, social political factors, for example. And so some languages are regarded as languages of future. You probably have come across this discourse before. Some languages are regarded as modernity. Some languages are regarded as give you an edge when you actually apply for a job. So the language can give you the promise of a better future. And then and I think there are also variations in different countries. Certainly in UK, language learning isn't the strength. Definitely isn't. And there are some discussion about, for example, whether Brexit will influence even more. There has been talking about crisis in language learners taking up language choices at the point of when they actually finish the GCSE, which is the entry point when you move on from the secondary school to preparing for the university entrance exam. So there are questions about, worries and concerns about the impact of Brexit on the take-up of languages. And on the other hand, up to a few years ago, Chinese has been regarded as a language future, language aspiration, has been very much positioned as the language. So in the lots of in schools here in England, you have seen Confucius classroom, where the children actually learn Chinese among other languages, and Spanish is also very popular. And in some probably private school, German is offered as popular as one of the choices, but I'm afraid it's not as popular as Spanish or Chinese in some schools. I don't have the statistic, but I seem to remember German is slightly further down the list, but on the list, it's not the top priority, for example, but unfortunately.
Well, I think we should thank you, Zhu Hua, for this very inspiring talk, and for raising the topic of how we co-construct identities and relationships through communication and using language. And that is definitely a very important part of intercultural research and intercultural training. So with the theater context, which we represent, this is absolutely the appropriate input. So thank you very much for it. That was very engaging. So Antje, we have to address another point in closing up this session. Will you do it?
It is not quite your point, but I got so interested, we as Germans, we sometimes say this is the language of poets and thinkers. So it is in a way NET if we are talking about our language, it's a national and ethnicity talk if we say we speak the language of poets and thinkers. But, behind that self-criticism or ideologization of language, I would be very interested if in Chinese, something like that also exists, so that maybe every nation is very proud of their own language and creates, like nouns for that. Just the last question, sorry.
Absolutely. I think there's it's not overstatement. Chinese language, Chinese people hold dearly to their Chinese language, and it's you may have actually and there is certainly a fascination about the calligraphy, writing. You may, if you have been to China, you have seen, every bit of object, if they can, they will have some writing and in a beautifully presented. And on chopsticks, for example, on some grand places, statues, architecture is all very much involved with, and I sometimes think we live with Chinese calligraphy, and because it's very much actually ingrained into Chinese culture. And that's how important writing and literacy and then having the knowledge of the language is to Chinese speakers. And of course, related to this, there's also research saying, you know, understanding a different language helps you with your brain development, particularly if you are alphabetic speakers. Knowing another non-alphabetic speakers certainly give you a brain boost at some point if you learn younger and quickly enough. So I think all these are actually really interesting insight and views about differences in languages. In a way, Auntie, I think you made really good point about, you know, connecting these differences. These are really about how we see the differences and similarities and differences and commonalities between different languages and different people. And it's a fascinating area to look into in terms of to what extent similarities exist, differences matter.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I think we came to the end, Rudy, and we still have something to say, and I give over to you.
Okay. Okay. Antje and I are handing over our function as coordinators of the Zieta Frankel group by the end of this year. So this was the last of the webinars in this series. And we very much appreciate your interest and that you stayed with us in such great numbers for such a long time. This webinar will be put on the Zieta YouTube channel within a few days. So if you feel like it, you can review all the 10 presentations that made up this series. So thank you very much. And as we say in Germany, bleibt gesund.
Stay safe. Yeah, stay safe.
Exactly. So our tradition is this year and saying goodbye and applauding you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And say hello.
Yes.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Wow.
Bye.
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 Tschüss.
Tschüss. Macht's gut. Ciao,
Bye,
ciao.
everyone.